I'll go ahead and ask the question again. Uh, did you ever feel that there was a point in your tenure as president of the IAA where you butted head to head with agribusiness and the kind of issues that you talked about earlier?
Well, I was president of the IAA from 1970, December 1970, until 1983, 13 years. Remember now, the years, 70 to 83. I came head to head with one group of industry or business in that year, in that period. And that was the banking industry. And most specifically, the farm credit system. And that was initiated by a knock on the back door here at the farm. And a lending officer from that system locally came and said, Harold, there's a farm going to be sold right up the road here, 160 acres. You ought to buy it. We'll loan you 100%, whatever it brings, because land's going to go to $10,000 an acre, and you better get into it. Repeat, loan me 100%, be a collateral loan. And I'd hear other stories. And because of the Illinois Farm Bureau's statewide responsibility, statewide activity, I'd come to know the three presidents of the farm credit system in St. Louis. They were responsible, as I recall, Arkansas, Missouri, Illinois, and maybe Wisconsin. Basically that area. I called, made a meeting with their three presidents. The presidents would have been the Bank for Co-ops, the Land Bank, and the PCA's short-term credit, intermediate short-term credit. Maybe there were four presidents. Could have been broken into two or three or four then anyway. I said, gentlemen, I'm really, really deeply concerned because we farmers, and now that I have a responsibility in Farm Bureau to keep people informed, we have a responsibility to express to you a real deep feeling that you're no longer carrying out the kind of lending procedure that you used to. You meaning the system. Because farm credit has earned a championship ribbon of quality loans. And a loan is good only when it's good for the lender and the borrower. Otherwise, it's not a good loan. Said, you know that far better than I. But for some reason, you have changed your system. And I told them, knock on the door, give you 100%. I said, gentlemen, that's land bank. I would have to believe that probably operating loans maybe are that lax too. And maybe bank for co-ops, I don't know. But I'm saying it's my absolute judgment, my sincere, honest to goodness judgment that you are no longer a service, a sound service to farmers. You're taking them on the road to oblivion. Answer. Don't worry, everything's in good hands. I'm not saying this to make fun of people. That's not it. I'm not saying that to give me credit. That's not it. I had a staff. We talk. We put things together. But I had a very personal, first-hand example of saying this would be a lousy judgment on my part to commit my total collateral for not having one penny to pay for 160 acres. Maybe then was bringing 3,500 an acre, whatever it was. That was about the top then. I said, how can this be? Again, if I hadn't been in the military, I probably would have done it. The military, as I mentioned, taught me, quote, leadership. Oh, I was naive as a little country kid when I went in. A few sergeants taught me some fundamental questions. You don't always believe people. Because I remember this very well. I was out there in Fort Sill, hot. Finished 2 years college. Should have been known better. But I believed everyone. I believed them. I'd never played poker. I believed people because that's the way I grew up. You believed your neighbor. And as I said a little earlier, you believed the teacher, the preacher, and the judge. And this sergeant said, Steele, I want to give you a little help. Tomorrow we're going to go on a forced march and then we're going to go through an infiltration course. That Oklahoma red soil is so hot it'll put blisters right on your belly when you're crawling on that ground. Wear your winter underwear. That'll give you some insulation. I said, that makes sense. The next morning he said, did you do what I told you? Yes, sir, Sergeant, I sure did. A little later he comes up, he said, now, we're going to take off. Take a little red man here and tuck it right here. That'll keep moisture coming in your mouth. I already had a canteen of water. Now, I'd worked in the field. I'd done some of these things, but I hadn't been in a forced march before. And I was good bait on that one too, and I put a little red man there. Never had it before. When I walked about 200 yards, I said, I don't need this anymore. And I got rid of it. And when I got to that infiltration, I think I left a muddy trail right behind me as I sweat. I was dumb, naive. It taught me a lesson. You don't believe everything you hear. So when that officer came in here to loan me money, I said to myself, Steele, don't be duped into that. So I talked to the presidents, tell them my heartfelt belief that they had left the trail of quality loans that had been built up from World War I until mid-1970s. And I was assured, no problem. Sometime later, on WGN Radio, the crystal voice of Orion Samuelson. Folks, I have a little news today. The word's out that the farm credit system's in trouble. So I called so-and-so, who's from Wisconsin at that time. He's the #1 man, and I said, understand the farm credit... No, I had it right. What I said about Orion is correct. And he said, but the media got a hold of the #1 executive. And he said, no problem. About 2 weeks later, Orion's on again, same subject, same service. And he said, well, we're studying into it. We're looking at it very carefully. The third time, Orion came on. And yes, there's serious problems in the farm credit system. Serious problems, and they're studying into it. Yes, that's the one time in my tenure, that 13 years, where I challenged them, and that was the outcome. I had no reason to challenge anyone in the poultry industry. We have poultry. Didn't have any reason in the pork industry because it hadn't taken place. It was prior to that. No. We had this separation. We had all of the agencies functioning. The executive branch in the federal government was functioning under the Packers and Stockyards Act in the USDA. The Justice Department was functioning, carrying out their responsibilities in holding some of these hoped-for growth factors not to exist in a way of control. Happened after that.
I mean, I'm going to ask a kind of a side. You see those changes beginning?
I've seen them in two different aspects. #1, pork. When certain companies, certain individuals, Murphy from Virginia. Been an ag teacher. Murphy started building units, taking control, ownership, from the squeal up to the point of converting that squeal into meat. Nothing to do with processing. He didn't have that. It was strictly production. That's the first head to pop up. Murphy failed because he did not have processing. And who bought out Murphy? Smithfield. Smithfield now hold the whole thing from squeal to meal. Had the whole thing. Then we saw ADM step in. And we saw up here in Minneapolis step in. The biggest privately held corporation in the United States, maybe in America, maybe in the world, not sure. There was about 4 of them, big ones. And as they have stepped in, one of their major methods of stepping is sort of like what I'd mentioned before, which George Brower. Now there's a family in Illinois that produce 2 million hogs a year. But they're in the area of between, in the old days, between the producer and the processor. Only in this case, they are the family that have this tremendous skill in not only pork production, but expanding beyond a family to include hundreds and hundreds of producers. Tremendous skill, but in a business arrangement with the parent organization in Minneapolis, who has the capital and the system of converting that live hog to a product in the meat market for the housewife. So there's the whole program. But that company is depending upon this family to take care of this very important area. And history would say that family better watch out, because when their skills have been utilized, you're going to get a smaller share of the pie, because after all, Daddy has the risk. You see what I'm saying? Little by little, but you don't read it. Doggone it, you don't read it. I got a newspaper from Montana, eastern Montana, about the second issue. Headlines: ADM fined $500 million, or whatever it was, maybe $550 million for illegal activities in sweeteners. And it goes into detail. The judge in Chicago has very definitely found them guilty and fined them accordingly. And then the article says, you remember, they were fined to a lesser amount for another similar thing X number of years ago. And then you turn the page. But ADM has said, we're going to send 2 of our board members to Washington to see if this can't be modified. And they were successful, cutting out so many millions of dollars. I knew one of the board members. And we all knew one of the others because he'd been the former Premier of Canada on ADM board. And I said, why do I have to get a newspaper from eastern Montana to find out the news from Chicago and a prominent ADM in Decatur, Illinois? Why don't I hear it on the radio stations, the local one, out of Chicago, out of Springfield, and why don't I read it in a paper? And I said to myself, thanks, Army. Thanks, United States government, for teaching me not to be fooled. What's going on that a corporation can keep news that's vital to people, because this same corporation now is selling, we want your contracts for grain. They've proven themselves to be very, very dishonest. And as we know, one of the family members was moved out they obviously have proven that they are not honorable. This really bothers me now that, and other farmers didn't have a chance to see what the scamps are and why they're doing these things. That really disturbs me deeply about my country and about why our members lose their lives to protect our freedom when these scallywags are carrying on like this. Are they controlling the media?
Well, you talked about somebody like Orion Samuelson, who is a major voice in agriculture and is an advocate for the farmer. Why doesn't he have that kind of voice?
I can't put myself into Orion's place. I've known him almost since the first day he came to Chicago. Orion is a tremendous person. The only way, I'd say, I'm going to guess now, about 6-7 years ago, the manager of WGN cut out the noon show. Just cut out the noon show. Today, Orion's on there 3 or 4 times, except on Saturday. So I wrote a letter to the manager of WGN. I said, I want to extend my voice to you in the area of agriculture. I'm a farmer, always been a farmer, and a noon show from a city radio station that's so important, WGN, you have a tremendous station with a tremendous voices of Orion and Max to keep us up to date on factors in the city that extend over in agriculture, as well as the direct information we need on marketing and worldwide activities on marketing, worldwide activities and what we might expect. It's a voice that's so important, now it's going to be lost. Please reconsider. I was then advised later that the reason he did that is more money will channel in from other kinds of programming. So using that key, I suspect that Orion has to generate so many dollars to stay on the air. Or is that generation? ADM is mighty important. Others are mighty important. And if thou say one that's bad word about me, might go to someplace else. I mean, that's country thinking to me. I say, here, let's take that same question to another area. And I've mentioned a couple of times that there are rules, regulations, and laws with teeth in the USDA, in GIPSA. It was originally Packers and Stockyards Act. Now they've added grain to it, called GIPSA. That department in the USDA has all of those qualities, but they're not being utilized. And the records are very clear, broad and deep. Many, many requests for investigation, why my request for clarity to be carried out hasn't been done. Why? No answers, no answers. The Inspector General of the USDA said this has been going on for years and give you all the particulars. Neither party cares. Or the Justice Department. Again, they have those capabilities and refuse to function. Why? I don't know. I have my suspicions. I have my suspicions. But if I can't prove it, I better keep my mouth shut.
We'll go to a different topic. We'll go back, jump back to your tenure as IAA president, and you talked about the King of the Hill philosophy that you had about the United States. And somebody had mentioned to me that your particular tenure was marked by increased development of international markets. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes. You know, as we read the history book, and as I talk to some of my good friends in the southern states producing tobacco, both the history books and these voices say the same. when the colonies first started in this new land, their first product to export for needed goods and capital was tobacco. Tobacco. That was revered by England. That was revered by the continent. All they could produce. Great movement. But as the country developed more, we had a balance of feed grains with usage. We had all this grassland, we produced beef, we used it domestically. We didn't have the transportation. We didn't have the method of converting the live animals to a saleable product. But after World War II, this started to break loose more, and we started exporting more agricultural products, feed grains, but not so much livestock, but again, because we didn't have those features necessary to safely and productively export. But then, with modern transportation and so forth coming into being, it was vital to the resilience and the movement of product to other countries, because we were converting more animals into meat than we needed domestically, and we needed a market. So we had several trade missions. Some of those trade missions were to Japan, even to China. Back in '72, went to Russia. China the first time was '78, right after Mao Zedong died. We didn't yet have a diplomatic relation with China in '78. That came thereafter. Somebody with the name of George Bush was our representative there, but he wasn't an official person. We didn't have that relationship. They said that George the Barber used to go peddling down the streets with the Chinese as they built a little relationship. So yes, that was the early growth. We had ocean-going vessels, we had air carriers. We can take fresh meats around the world. And so we helped develop those markets.
How much foreign travel did you have to do?
Minimal compared to on a daily basis. It would maybe be once or twice a year at that time. Then it grew into maybe a little more frequently than that. We saw during my tenure, the last commodity group come into being was the Meat Export Federation, at that time headquartered in Denver. I think probably it still is. That was the last commodity group. Before that, we saw the pork, the beef, and so forth, as well as now then corn and soybean produced. So Farm Bureau acts more as a cohesive agency trying to bring the groups together.
When you dealt with politicians in your position, and presidents, I would assume, did you have any direct contact, and what presidents did you have direct contact with?
Well, the closest president I had a contact with President Reagan. This close contact came from two sources. One, being from Illinois, perhaps he felt a little closer to Illinois, and when he ran for president the first time, he had a meeting in Bloomington, and that's where Illinois Farm Bureau is headquartered. And so through staff, I had a personal meeting with him at a luncheon. Then my second source was one of my closest friends here at home grew up with Ronald Reagan, and they retained a lifelong friendship. And I remember his name was Light Thompson. I talked with Light once, and I said, Light, there's strange things going on in Washington. 4 of us had an hour meeting with the #1 man responsible for our monetary system and our balance of monetary system. Of course, right now his name slips, the tall man with a cigar. Oh, jeez, I'm ashamed of myself. He was head of the. Oh boy! Oh boy! Oh boy! Glad this is on film. You can cut it out. Greenspan. Who was the head of Greenspan?
Benincke?
Head of Greenspan.
Oh, before Greenspan?
Yeah. That's who it was anyway. And we had an hour meeting with him, and during that hour meeting, I said, Mr. Chairman, we've come here really in a fashion to help to give you some information that might be vital in your overall responsibility. Agriculture is this nation's #1 industry. We're now at 22, heading for 23% interest. This is not only bringing havoc, but it's bringing absolute disaster to farmers. They're going broke. They cannot handle this interest rate because the things that produce, the commodities that farmers produce is sold on a market. It's a competitive market, and you take what's offered. You can bargain to an extent, but very little. That the representatives bargain for you, and it's a set price. And it's in terrible conditions. Well, after 1 hour, the chairman said to his secretary, extend this for another half. This was the first time that he had heard the agricultural side of this nation's incredibly complex monetary system. And we had what I felt was a very, very productive meeting with him, giving him a first-hand feel of the agriculture's industry's total disarray with this tremendously high interest, particularly to those farmers and ranchers that didn't have long-term interest fixed.
Well, how did you become?
So I called Light. I said, Light, I don't think the president's really got a good fix on what's going on over there. I just wish it, but I understand the relationship between the White House and this very important part of the government. They try to stay arm's length. They're not part of the executive branch. It's an independent agency, and it should be. So, a few days later, I came home. Margie said the White House called. I said, Margie, April Fool's Day to you. This is the first day of April. She said, no, I'm serious. The White House called. Pretty soon, phone rang, and it was President. And we made reference to the fact that we'd visited some before. And he said, I understand that you met with a very important man in our economic system. Would you feel free to tell me about it? I said, Mr. President, I would. Because I think it's vital that you know as much as I know, and I'm sure that the chairman didn't tell me anything that shouldn't be public information. So I related to him our interplay. So we probably talked half hour, 45 minutes. And I said, Mr. President, as long as we're chatting, and I know you're under a lot of pressure to get things done. Mr. President, you made 3 promises to people when you were running for president. And I'm mighty proud to have voted for you because I believe what you say is what's going to happen. And you promised that you're going to have a balanced budget. You promised you're going to strengthen the armed forces to meet the demands of freedom of our country. And you made a promise of balanced budget, armed forces. Third one. I said, Mr. President, you've done 2, but that balanced budget didn't really come in balanced. I said, Mr. President, Mr. President, yes, I'm here. I'm listening. As a country kid, I'm going to have to believe that there's one line item that prevents that. That line item is what we refer to now as there's a line item in the budget. We call it, of course, then it spilled right out. Social Security comes under, food aid comes under, all these things that we are, entitlement, the entitlement programs, Mr. President. I think that messed up having a balanced budget. He was very quiet. And I think that was it. Our entitlements, entitlements, entitlements. The only thing we should be entitled to in America is an opportunity. Opportunity. But we the people have gotten into the notion that if we elect certain people, we'll have more entitlements. And when we look at the authors of our Constitution, one of those authors, and I believe it was Benjamin Franklin, said, "This country will continue to grow strong until the people learn that they can vote themselves money. Then it will dissipate."
Some of those entitlements come to farmers, and how do you feel about that?
Depends upon which ones we're talking about. If it's entitlements for soil conservation, that's for the good of the people, for all of us, to preserve our soil, because we have historically broken up that cover of soil on certain wind-blown areas, certain soil types, certain topographies that should not be disturbed, and it should be preserving the soil to put into timber, to put into grasslands, but not be tilled. That's for the good of the nation. I'm in favor of that. If it's right now, I have to believe in the current president when he said, "I will veto the farm bill because certain rich farmers are getting too much money now when their commodity prices already are giving them a profit." And I think he has a very valid point.
You became...
It's called an umbrella. You know, that's another statement made years and years ago about the signing of the Constitution. When people want a safety net, they are disregarding the real aspects of this country, a safety net, and I agree with that. A safety net is saying, I want guarantee. And again I say, the only guarantee we should have is opportunity. And if you go beyond this, you better have some very, very basically sound reasons. And I think we don't have. We're using today by remote expressions, safety net, baloney. You shouldn't have a safety net unless there's reason to try to overcome these monopolies that exist. Monopolies. We're breaking apart our system. We're bringing it into shambles, in my notion, in agriculture.
You served in Washington, D.C. as head of Farm Credit for 4 years. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes, that's the Farm Credit Administration, which is separate from the Farm Credit System. It's an arm's length regulator. And I might say that during that tenure I found out the difference between a regulator, a bank regulator, and a catfish. One of them is a bottom-loving, scum-sucking parasite, and the other one is a southern delicacy. So when I went into the country and I said to them, "I'm from the federal government, I'm here to help you," they said, "Yes, you bet." So I'm just saying that as this good old symbol of Americanism. I'm a federal government, I'm not here to help you, I'm here to interfere. And our duties were simple. Our duties were this. The Farm Credit Administration, the arm's length regulator, were to keep the system safe and sound to the borrower and to the lender. So our staff, when I went there, was 500 people. That's an independent agency of the executive branch of government. These 500 people, by the most part of the 500, perhaps 70%, 75%, were examining the books of all of the lending institutions of the Farm Credit System to make sure that they were within regulations in all details, minute, careful examination within the confines of the regulations. Exactly. Now the President of the United States at that time, George Bush, said, and Ronald Reagan, President Reagan said this too, relax, regulators relax. You have to let the competitive enterprise system function. You don't want to tie it so it's disabled. And I agree with that. I agree with that. But safety and soundness, no. I'm sure that both of those presidents I mentioned did not include disregarding safety and soundness. I wouldn't even want to drive on the interstate if there wasn't a policeman. Safety and soundness, reasonableness. And that's what then we did, carrying out those responsibilities. But I'd like to back up just a little bit. When I was going through with the Senate, I was recommended by the President to take this position. But the Senate Agriculture Committee and then the final vote of the total Senate was required. And during that hearing with the Senate, they said this: the largest bank in the history of the United States is now in receivership. It's in Jackson, Mississippi, and it's one of the banks of the Farm Credit System. And it's in receivership, and it's taking the cash from the other banks and wringing them out. And it's part of the demise of the whole system. Will you take care of that if we give you the red light or green light? I said, I will study it carefully. Now remember, during this system of procedure, I was not even permitted to go through the gates of the Farm Credit Administration. I was not permitted to talk to anyone. I didn't even know the staff people there. And that's the way it should be. So I couldn't promise I would take care of it, because I didn't know the capability of the staff. I didn't know the whole picture at all of the Farm Credit System's insolvency. Not only did I look into it, but I also found out that I had the privilege of bringing in outside specialists. That's part of the budget. That's part of the authority that I had vested in me as the chief operating officer, chief executive officer. So I did. I brought in 2 people. Both of them had had previous experience in the farm credit system, in the administration. One was an economist. He was a very, very bright person. I'd served with him on a previous committee for 2 years. I'd gotten to know him. And that's again, President Reagan had named me the chairman of an agency to study the financial condition of agriculture and agribusiness, to report to the Senate and the House, because it had been a congressionally mandated study. So I'd gotten to know John Brake, an economist from New York. And I also got to know another person, because I brought him into the Farm Bureau as our general counsel, a very, very bright person who was with a firm in Washington, D.C. The firm was headquartered in Chicago, and he had spent a tour of duty as a general counsel of the Farm Credit System. I thought, here's 2 people that I know very well that have those qualities and those capabilities and those experiences. Perfect. Within 6 months, that Jackson Bank was taken care of through the skill of outsiders. Now, the thing that bothered me was this. I had some very, very, very capable people in that agency, but I couldn't know them that first day, or that first week, or that first month. If I'd been them, I would have been very disappointed in this new guy for not using my talents. But I want to take that just a step further. I'd spent 13 years with the finest executive staff people in the state of Farm Bureau in Bloomington. I want to tell you how great they were. And the best is by example. I had mentioned previously in this discussion today the very, very complex structure of the Illinois Farm Bureau because it included all of the family. And at that time, some 250,000 members, much larger now. And through staff, got the name of a person that was a professional in looking at an organization and looking at its structure and finding ways to make it more efficient, more expedient, and more professional. He happened to be born in Germany of Jewish extraction. Came to this country. He escaped the Hitler net. And with broken English, on a hot day, he came into my office. Mr. Steele, I'd like to talk to you. I'm going to take my coat off. It's so hot. It's air conditioned here, but I am so hot because I've just come back from a long walk, thinking of what I had to tell you. Mr. Steele, I have come to this country, this great country out of choice. I'm a German Jew. I escaped Hitler. I'd heard all these things about America, and now I'm an American. But Mr. Steele, this is probably 1975. I came here seeing this great country, but in most recent years, I've seen things happen that reminded me of what was going on in Germany when Hitler first took over. And I shall never forget some of those things that happened. Like people weren't as free to talk. That the government took over. That there's a new kind of control of people. Mr. Steele, up until this occasion, I've worked only with large corporations, Standard Oil, General Electric, the big companies, East Coast, West Coast. Those are the executives I've talked to until I came here. And he'd wipe his brow. Mr. Steele, for the first time I've seen what I'd heard. The strength of America is in the country. The strength of America is in the country. Mr. Steele, this Farm Bureau has a structure that cannot possibly work. But it does for one reason. Mr. Steele, this staff is so dedicated they give their life for Farm Bureau. Leave it like it is because of your people. It's America that I grew up in. Some of those things have changed that I grew up in. I think the staff there is still the same. But it's one of the few. Because of some of the things I've mentioned. I think as a nation we haven't learned to live with prosperity. I think greed is too important to too many people. And I think our federal elected officials are now saying, I'm going to work for myself to be reelected.
Let me ask you this about the future of food. The whole question of food versus ethanol, the fuel issue. How do you feel about that?
You may have read that about 2 weeks ago, an announcement was made. First to the members of the Senate and the House through their daily publication, and thence through our enlightenment, through radio, newspapers, magazines, that the organization has been pinpointed that was the cause of creating the fictitious sentiment in belief and quote fact, quote unquote, that the high grain prices were causing the food to escalate so much in value that it can't even be bought by people in other countries or starving to death because of ethanol. Propaganda. Propaganda. It named the organizations. Nestle, the one in the one in Omaha. Food companies, Sunkist, food companies put this propaganda together to try to, according to the written word, try to protect themselves, the real culprits in increasing their profits. And I mentioned how much the farmers receive under $6 corn with a box of cornflakes. 8 cents maybe? It went through several litanies of what it did to food prices. It is terrible that people will do this, and they should be, but they probably won't be. They should be penalized very severely, because that does not fit America when the population of America is hungry for facts, particularly during a time when we're in war, particularly in a time when this nation is under stress fiscally, particularly at a time when people have been saying, give us facts. And then here's a group that knowingly violated the principles of honor and decency, castigating the food producers in something that wasn't true. That's terrible. That does not fit what America is. And it named them in the paper. I don't have those names. I only named one that I'm sure of.
The other question is about importation of food. I mean, you've heard in the news just recently about the safety question of tomatoes. How do you feel about that?
Yes, we could talk about tomatoes, we could talk about mad cow disease, and we could talk about some other outbreaks. And I should like to break this question into 2 parts. The first part is domestic production, and the other is our total food supply. And unbeknownst to a lot of people, including a lot of we farmers, we're not totally aware at all about the amount of food supply we're bringing in from other countries. Our domestic production has been carefully programmed since almost the beginning of food quality. When we as a people became concerned with food quality, we have established the food quality standards. Let me speak about grain. Corn has to weigh 56 pounds. It cannot have over 1.5% foreign material, 1% damaged kernels. It has to meet the odor to make sure it's fresh. It has to meet all these standards. Otherwise, you're penalized at the marketplace. In the meat industry, under the USDA, we have meat inspectors, and in Illinois, we have state meat inspectors, that every animal that's slaughtered for human consumption outside the family, that's slaughtered for their own use, has to meet, by the inspector, these standards. Absolutely. And that's the way it should be. The same is true with fruits and vegetables. As we go out to the cornfield, we are guided by certain usages of procedures of production, like herbicides and insecticides. We have to be careful on soil quality, as it might be infested with animal effluent, as it might break loose from containers. These are all standard to protect the consumer. Amen. They should be done as long as they're fair to both parties. But we do not have those same standards of inspection for imported foods. To give an example, our son Greg joined the Illinois Ag Leadership Foundation. It's a 2-year program, and 1 year of this is foreign travel. They went to South America. They went to Brazil, to Peru, to other nations there. And when Greg came back, he said, Dad, found out something. You know, we have strict standards here on food production. Down there they don't. Human waste for fresh fruits, vegetables. So I said, Margie, from now on, when we go to the store, we know it's not inspected because they don't have the inspectors. And look at that label very carefully. If it says Peru on it, do not buy it. I do not want anything from Peru when I know now what they use for nutrients. So,
we only have a few more minutes left. I'd kind of like you to summarize where you think agriculture is going, just in as few words as possible. And
I think that agriculture, the only value of history is a guide to the future. And recent history points to the fact that fewer farmers will farm more acres. That fewer farmers will have a competitive market. To go further, says to me, unless leadership in America causes a retraction and a prevention of future monopolies, no farmer, no livestock producer will have a competitive market. It will all be top-down management. And the consumer will pay the bill because that value of that product at the grocery store will be set by these monopolistic organizations that telling you what you're going to pay or you won't get it. Simple, I believe.
thank you.